Okay, you should be live now. Good morning, afternoon, evening. Delete as applicable to time zone. How are we all doing? So the first couple of minutes is just going to be kind of the sound check, just as there'll be a bit of a delay between my saying stuff and you guys hearing it as usual. So when you do start hearing this, could you please drop a message in the chat and just tell me what the sound quality is like? Thank you. I've just dropped an announcement on My Aberdeen, and you should all have a copy of it emailed with details regarding the exam, just FYI. Simonis, thank you very much indeed. Excellent. Glad you can hear me. Sorry about the dead air there. I was just double checking something. And it appears I've made a bit of a mistake, guys. So, yeah, I'm just looking at the new online exam diet here. And in that announcement I just said I've actually put in the wrong dates for the exam. I'm going to send out a rectifying announcement now, and it'll drop into your email trays in just a second. My apologies about that. Sorry guys, I'll be back in just 1 sec. I'm just typing out that announcement. I want to rectify that as quickly as possible, especially for those who are unable to join us just now. Okay, so I think that's all done now. Right. So, with today's revision live stream, what I would mostly like to do is really field questions from you guys about the course in terms of its content. What would you like me to cover? What points would you like me to address? This could be as little as clearing up any definitions that you may be unsure about, to big concepts, whether theoretical or practical. Um, Additionally, it could be about the foreign policies of any of the actors we've looked at over the course. It could be any of the institutions, any of the security issues, such as energy security, nuclear weapons, hybrid warfare, um, and indeed any of the kind of the crisis or the crisis we've looked at, the potential crises which may emerge, um, whether that's Ukraine or otherwise. So just all this kind of stuff. Whatever you want to know, whatever you want to ask, just pop it in the chat, and we'll address it as it comes up. But just to kind of fill the air in between those questions, I'm going to do a kind of an overarching synopsis, just a brief one, and just go through some of the stuff that we've covered in previous weeks, and basically just try and link the whole thing together. Okay. Course material. Sorry, my apologies. I'm just opening something up there. Is the sound still okay? I noticed the numbers are kind of popping in and out, and I'm not sure if that's people's internet connections or whether that's the sound quality on my end. I just want to make sure. According to my stuff, everything should be running quite smoothly. But to be honest, I'm making this up as I go along at the best of times when it comes to this technology stuff. Sounds good. All right. Oh, yep. Excellent. Thanks, Simonis. Thanks, Pavel. Right then. So, just while you guys start considering what you would like to use this stream to go over, and by all means, throw ideas out. That's going to be the most useful things we do. Is if I'm able to address your guys' questions directly, if I can go over the stuff that you want to know about directly, that's so much the better. But for now, we'll start with a kind of lecture synopses, and I'm not going to make these kind of reruns of the lectures themselves, because we'll be here forever doing that. But just to cover the kind of the main points of each one. So casting our minds all the way back to week 1, we started with strategy, and we were looking at the meaning of strategy and some core definitions related to strategic theory. So from the basics as to what is meant by kind of war and warfare to introducing some of the more particular strategic concepts which we would go on to use. For example, alliances and deterrence. Now, the basic definition of strategy is the art of using force against intelligent adversaries towards the attainment of policy objectives. Now, force does not have to be synonymous with violence in this regard, and it's a broad term. It can be applied to a lot of things. The natural kind of meaning generally is related to the sort of the political struggle between political actors, but it's been applied a lot to other fields of life as well, with varying degrees of success. And basically, the purpose of strategy um, isn't to kind of create plans or even particularly execute plans. It's to facilitate the exercise of that power of imposing one's will upon reality in a context in which there are potentially competing actors. We also discussed sort of the nature of strategy. The nature of power as well. And now, as you all know, I know this is very much going against the orthodoxy at the moment. I've never particularly had much time for this kind of breaking up of power into hard and soft and economic. um, there's nothing, just purely on the basis that there's nothing soft about effective power, no matter from where it comes from. And foreign policy and the conduct of foreign policy needs as many tools as it can get its hands on, and these often actually work in conjunction with one another. Hard power is meaningless without uh, military force is meaningless without diplomacy. It's kind of blind, deaf, and dumb without diplomacy. And likewise, economic power is threaded all through this, whether it's greasing the wheels of diplomacy or whether it's the sinews of war. These things are fundamentally inseparable from one another. Now, I'm not going to go over the strategic unless someone pops up in the chat with a particular question about this, because the strategic concepts are all laid out in the lecture slides, and as far as I can see, they seem to be pretty straightforward. But if like I say, if someone has a question, then that's fine. So yeah, week one we talk about strategy. And there's that quite useful matrix as well for looking at strategic imperatives. So, for example, if one is a status quo power, the threat of force is deterrent, and the use of force is generally going to be, at its heart, defensive. And there's such a thing as kind of attacking to defend. We call these sorts of things preemptive strikes or preventative strikes. But the overall orientation of one's posture is going to be fundamentally defensive. You may wage war to protect what you have, to protect your position, to protect the existing order. But like I say, your orientation is going to be small c conservative. It literally trying to conserve what the current balance is. And conversely, if you're attempting to kind of alter the status quo, the threat of force is going to be fundamentally coercive. Coercive is about producing action and ultimately producing change, whereas the use of force is going to be fundamentally offensive. It's fundamentally attempting to proactively reshape the world to one's own liking, to better suit one's own will and one's own disposition. We looked at the classic security dilemma as well, and a few of those other great strategic concepts. Applying them to Europe. So if anyone has unless anyone has any questions or points that they'd like to go over, that's pretty much really all I wanted to say by recap of week one. I mean, these are so week one and week two, as you recall, are the kind of theoretical weeks. It's from these 2 weeks that the kind of the academic underpinnings, the theoretical underpinnings of what we're about for the rest of the course are really established. These are, I'm not terribly fond of this metaphor, but these are sort of the lenses that allow us to see these otherwise extremely complicated phenomena and make a sort of sense of them, bring them into focus without distorting them. Now, geopolitics, quite simply, is the sort of the nexus of people, power, time, and place. All four of these factors are utterly intrinsic. You know, to just start with kind of linking them up, well, people as they relate to power, that's kind of politics. That really covers that up quite nicely. All of this has to happen in a place, so that's the kind of geo bit taken care of. And the oft underrated and undervalued and underappreciated concept of time, which is thoroughly integral to this, because snapshots can only tell one so much, and in fact, generally tell one very little. Geopolitics can only be understood to any degree of sophistication by understanding its context within time. So, what kind of conspiring of events, what actions of individuals and groups, what imperatives led, what trends and patterns led to this point in time. You must understand history. And likewise, to have any sort of sense of where we're going, you need to understand how things are now. You need to understand how they're likely to look next week, and moreover, how people think they're going to be kind of further along the line. Nobody can predict the future, and to be honest, those that sort of try to do so with any degree of certainty are either overemphasizing their own capabilities or are just outright charlatans. But we can make observations based on what we do know. We can make sensible hypotheses. We can deduct and induct reasonable suppositions from what's going on today, and without being sort of too specific about it, we can plan for it. And certainly, when it comes to foreign policy, that whole business about diplomacy, about is what's there to let your kind of political unit survive until the next century. That's where that kind of comes into play. So time is tremendously important. And yeah, I went on to kind of give the examples, the sort of simple example of the ant colonies, um, which, despite being sort of non-human, so technically violates the people aspect of this, although they are actors. Yeah, I quite like it. But and this is true of the kind of the rise and fall of any great political unit. But the rise of the US really is quite a stark and relevant, of course, way of illuminating this. The United States did not end up the kind of the world's superpower, only superpower at the moment, fully formed, although it did develop really quite rapidly. But rather, this was a complicated mixture of events related to people, related to power, related to place, which played out over time. And the complexity of it's really quite staggering. There's a whole bunch of variables go into this, and it's only once those variables are established that we can look at certain conditions and think, well, it seems quite reasonable to suppose a superpower would emerge here. And that's really once you get into the sort of the latter half of the 19th century. Once it becomes clear that the policy of manifest destiny is going to lead to a continent-sized country with an abundance of every natural resource relevant or known to man. The fact that it enjoys such a benign security environment, protected by the Pacific and the Atlantic, with radically less powerful, less ambitious, and fundamentally just less threatening neighbours to its north and south. Now, there are a few controversies with geopolitics, and some of these have come from sort of historical notoriety, which is to say that they've been taken out of context, misunderstood, or been attached to some pretty nasty people and ideas. So, for example, the notion of Lebensraum in Nazi Germany to justify the expansion into Eastern Europe. I really hope I pronounced that right. So the funny thing about German, a slight emphasis on one syllable or another can radically change the meaning of the word. And in the case of Lebensraum, it's the difference between living space and loving space, which are draw two very quite different connotations. Likewise, people who ultimately fundamentally don't understand geopolitics have kind of either inverted it to pursue a kind of discriminatory or racist agenda, or have accused environmental politics of being racist and discriminatory, which is just fundamentally a misunderstanding of what this is about. This really is the argument that people develop, and their politics are related to their environment. It's really as simple as that. When we start using it to explain things, it gets a bit more complex, but ultimately, that's what it is. Excellent. Right, for any of you who might have joined in the last little while, I'm just doing a brief synopsis of each of the lectures. But the most valuable thing we can be doing today is just you guys asking any questions you want cleared up before the exams. Just absolutely anything at all. Just drop a message in. Just a quick bit of housekeeping at this point. I've been asked if I'll go over one or two of the university's positions. Obviously, I'm sure you guys are getting a flurry of emails as well. That's kind of hard to keep up with. But basically, there's going to be a school-wide announcement within the next day or so, after the weekend at the latest, which will just be sort of confirming the university's position on a number of things. I know you've been getting information probably quite haphazardly. Trust me, so have we. We're all just adapting to this hopefully temporary situation. There has been planning in place for if teaching needs to go on remotely even into next semester. I mean, we're all hoping it isn't going to come to that, but we're not idle. We are on it. And again, for those of you who have just come in, please check your announcements or your. I've sent it so it'll come through your email as well. Just about the exam, and then a clarification, because I got the date wrong in the initial one. But the exam is going to go live on the 4th of May. You're going to have a week to submit your answers via Turnitin over a simple document like Word. Really quite similar to how you submit an essay through Turnitin, to be honest. Like I say, we've managed to get a whole week for these, which I think makes sense. Really, I mean, it's not an unduly large amount of time when you consider the context of time zones and stuff like that. Also, that kind of school-wide bit of yellow text there also gives some very, very useful outlines on how to approach this. Because for most of you, I imagine, have never really done this sort of take-home exam business before, and it's sort of tricky because it's not really a proper exam, and it's not really an essay or a paper either. But one of the main ones is keeping your overall submission to 3,000 words, and just as you would allocate time evenly in an exam, allocate words equally when it comes to answering these questions, because ultimately, as with all exams, you could spend your resources, whatever it is, word or time. If you put 80% of it into the first answer and you produce this sort of gleaming, beautiful, well-crafted, insightful answer, and then you spend 20% of your time and resources kind of putting 20% into a rushly, sort of rough and ready but workable answer, and then you've got nothing left for the third. The highest you're going to get from that is a C because you've left 30% of the marks on the table. Matthew, I don't want to interrupt. No, no, please, by all means, do so. Uh, yeah, okay. Yeah. So Matthew, with regard to the um specific comments and deeper feedback, unfortunately, this has been one of those incidents where uh, a kind of a perfect conspiracy of things caused a bit of a catastrophe. I so enjoyed sort of old school marking your memos with pen and paper that I decided to do it with the essay feedback, and so you were going to get a kind of a printed hard copy sheet with all of my comments and thoughts, and I've put plenty of kind of pen and paper comments in the essays themselves. Unfortunately, however, with the university being locked down, you guys being dispersed, they are all currently sitting on my desk, and uh, basically they don't exist online. So I will endeavor to get kind of feedback to you as when I can, but I'm afraid it's gonna probably be a while on that. If there's anything specific you want to talk about, however, as always, feel free to drop me an email. We can have a chat about it. And obviously, as well, they're all still anonymized, so I haven't the foggiest idea who wrote what as well. So please bear that in mind too. But if there's anything specific you want to talk about, just feel free to drop me a line on that. Rebecca, are bibliographies referencing required for the essays? Yeah, for the exam pieces, no bibliographies, and referencing a citation's always great. I mean, if it was a traditional pen and paper exam, I would say if you can remember a statistic or a date or a fact or a quote and you can attribute it, so much the better. Since you will kind of have the resources to do so, that would be quite good. But as per the school guidance, you're not being expected to kind of go out and find heaps of original material. Um, you're really just to sort of prepare for this as you would an ordinary exam. So by consulting the lecture slides and your own notes, going over the course reading, maybe having discussions with one another about ideas. If you want to, I mean, it's not to say that I'm going to kind of stop you bringing in or penalize you for bringing in additional literature because we do expect you to go beyond the reading lists generally. But the point is, it's not like an essay where you have to bring in lots and lots and lots of outside stuff. And the thing is, of course, as well here, it's sort of it's trying to strike the balance between allowing you guys to basically to shine, to do to the best of your abilities, whilst preserving conditions and kind of control conditions which make it reasonably equitable for everyone. Now, obviously, this is easy enough when you're all in a room and you have the same amount of time. Um, but it's and none of you have kind of books on the table. Um, but in this context, it's a little bit more difficult to arrange. And I'm aware that I've kind of went on a bit with that answer, but I hope I've made that a bit clearer, Rebecca. Just to sum up, no bibliography is required. If you're dropping quotes or statistics, if you can drop a little citation in there, great. And have a read over that yellow highlighted text in the first announcement I sent out this afternoon, which will give you some pointers. Matthew, yeah, no problem. I'm really sorry about that, but like I say, just sort of drop me an email if you want to chat about your grade, and I can't make any promises. I usually have a fairly good memory for this sort of stuff, so if you can give me an idea of what your essay was about, I might kind of be able to work with that a little bit too. Okay, so I'm just going to carry on with kind of the third synopsis here, and if you guys just want to start keep dropping in questions, whether they're administrative or sort of housekeeping, or whether they're course or content related, that's absolutely fine. Please feel free to drop stuff in. You're not at all interrupting. That's kind of the great advantage of this format is you guys can type stuff to me in real time. Otherwise I would just upload a video, or at least I would try to. I haven't tested my tech skills quite that far yet, though I would imagine this is probably slightly more difficult, if anything. Okay, so week 3 we got into institutions, moving away from theory, and we covered 2 of the biggies, the EU and the OSCE. Now, again, this is one of those things where a lot of the particular stuff is sort of there on the slides, but broadly speaking, the EU as a security actor has had a lot of challenges, but also has a lot of ambition, and it's always been related to security. Whilst this is kind of overblown a lot in the sort of the rose-tinted glasses of hindsight, the European Coal and Steel Initiative, the 1956 treaty, was ultimately an economic treaty which was fundamentally based around security. It was to control the 2 materials one absolutely required in order to fight a large-scale industrial conflict. Without coal, without steel, you don't have heavy industry. If you don't have heavy industry, you can't produce the methods of the kind of the material of modern war. Whether that's from kind of from battleships to ball bearings. So there has always been that kind of implicit security component to it. However, as the EU has expanded, and particularly the post-Maastricht and post-Lisbon incarnations, it has tried to be an actor in of itself in security, and has met with largely mixed results, partially because most member states regard, especially the newer states, Britain in particular, not as a newer state, but as a traditional obstructionist power in this regard, doesn't believe that more resources should be put into a less efficient redundancy mechanism for NATO. Is basically what this boils down to. And also that in a model like sort of Europe, it's very difficult to conduct foreign affairs by committee, much less run sort of defence matters by committee. And we see this in kind of successful alliances. We see this in successful political units. There is a mechanism for streamlining defence matters. There is a mechanism for presenting a united front when it comes to foreign affairs. There's a reason, for example, that traditionally the remit of the US president was foreign affairs. It's because there should be a sort of central executive representing the national interest in this regard. So when you have a concert of almost 30 member states, each with sort of competing interests, each with competing views, having an equal say despite a tremendous imbalance of commitment and resources, it's very, very difficult to generate sort of joined up foreign policy, much less joined up defense policy. But with prospects for the future, well, not to paint an entirely bleak picture, there have been areas of success, and there are areas of promise as well. So, for example, whilst the battle groups are kind of much derided because they only exist on paper, and they're a very sort of watered down of this notion of this this Helsinki Accords attempt to produce a European army. What they've been kind of watered down to is these 1,500 man battle groups, which have never been sent anywhere, have never been constituted, and frankly, even if they were sent anywhere, 2 small forces of 3,000 personnel are really quite limited in terms of what they could meaningfully achieve without the prospect of rapid and sustained support anyway. But for the example of the battle groups being negative, there are positive examples. The EU's counter piracy missions, for example, in the sort of the just outside sort of the Red Sea off the Horn of Africa into the Persian Gulf, have been quite successful and have been quite quite well carried out. And oddly enough, because they take on, for all they're talked about as being a European project, actually they take on much the nature of how a traditional nation state goes about defense policy. There is a political objective set, resources are allocated to it, authority is then basically delegated to a chain of command, and they're left to sort of get on with it and go out and achieve those objectives whilst being under the scrutiny and under the authority of that kind of political actor. In this case, the EU, along with its member states, agreed that piracy is a threat to our economic well-being, as indeed it always has been. Something should be done. This is important enough to actually commit serious resources to it. You have a small concert of states with blue water naval capabilities send out their ships, and basically there's a sort of a hierarchy established in the military, and the military kind of carries that out, and that's maintained over several years. And likewise, there is sorry, one moment. There are other examples of where defense cooperation could be useful. So, for example, in areas like procurement, famously, a lot of modern hardware is quite difficult to procure, and there tend to be kind of very long lead times on it. The F-35 is the most egregious example in history. It's 10 years late, and it's cost well over $1 trillion at this stage. And if that is to be the future of military procurement, nation states are not going to be willing or able to do it by themselves. So greater cooperation here, although that has a sort of double-edged sword to it as well, because on paper, joined up procurement amongst friendly nations who don't intend to use this kit on one another makes a lot of sense, until you start getting down to the business of, well, where is this going to be done? And, are countries willing to have potentially a factory laid off, or factories worth of workers laid off in their own country because it makes sense for, say, Germany to build all of Europe's tanks and the British and the French to build all of the all of the planes and so on, and so just to give very rough examples. But basically, that will, unfortunately, that efficiency also can come with the cost of political consequences and personal consequences like job losses. And that's pretty much all I want to say on the EU as well. I mean, when we were going over this, coronavirus wasn't really a thing, but actually, one thing with the EU to keep in mind as well is what it's going to be like when this is over. And this is fascinating. There've been really three great sort of 21st century crises which have challenged the European Union, and challenged the European Union along lines on which it should be able to function. Well, if it's predominantly um, an economic relationship, then you'd think Europe's response to the kind of 2008 debt crisis would be better, whereas actually the Union barely sort of held itself together. I mean, it did manage to do so, but it certainly hasn't. In fact, I actually said this to someone not long ago. If there were to be another great recession, the Eurozone hasn't built up enough financial capital and political capital to survive another major recession, or to be able to exercise the kind of spending it did in 2008 and 9, because they spent vast sums of money and they just haven't had the time to kind of make good on those losses yet. And here we are kind of with coronavirus, which, in addition to its kind of public health and and all of the other kind of political ramifications, one of them is going to be enormously economic. So how the EU is going to be able to weather that crisis, the migration crisis, which is still there were still echoes of that really up until last year. Europe, this, if anything, exposed more divisions in Europe than it did produce kind of a united front, and provided a vast amount of ammunition to the kind of the latent and nascent Eurosceptic movements across the continent. And how the EU fares after this is going to be quite interesting, both in terms of the economics of it, but also what's really quite fascinating is even the most sort of Europhilic nations immediately pivoted back to state level politics. The response to this has not been, despite some empty rhetoric, conducted at the European level or anything like it. This has been a sort of a raw nation state uh, coordinated endeavor. Each nation has sought to look out for itself, up to and including the point of sort of requisitioning medical supplies bound for good European partners. So the ramifications this is going to have for the union are really going to be quite fascinating. Matthew, just to address your question there, um, you don't have to necessarily cite me for the lectures. In fact, you don't have to really cite lectures at all. For one thing, I'm going to be marking this, and I'll know when you've done so. So don't worry about that. Lectures are one of those things is we don't cite them predominantly because that is the information we're giving you. That's kind of the introduction to the topic. That's why it's not kind of pro forma to do it. You're welcome to use any readings in the course guide. Um, and like I say, I'm not going to stop you from using external stuff because you probably would have done that anyway. But it's just sort of to make it clear that you're not expected to go out and find 15 to 20 sources as you would with a conventional essays and read them, or sort of whatever. Whatever the number might be. Either way, it's just to point out that, as with a traditional exam, the core of what you do is ultimately going to be revision from what you've already got, stuff from the reading list, and when you want to use examples, trying to kind of venture outside the lecture slides a little bit, as it would be with a normal exam. Okay, so moving on to NATO then, and the kind of the part two of the institutions. So NATO, much like the European Union, is one of these institutions which emerges out of the aftermath of the Second World War, both in terms of the new balance of power, what kind of little standing the major European powers had surviving kind of the First World War. Their kind of position on the world stage is very much overshadowed now by the United States and the Soviet Union. Britain in particular is kind of trying to find a new place, particularly as sort of the 19th century age of European imperialism is coming to a close. And Europe is now divided essentially into the transatlantic camp and the Soviet camp, the kind of the Warsaw Pact, those lands which were liberated and occupied by the Western powers and the Soviet Union at the close of World War II. And much like the European coal and steel treaty, it's a mechanism for not just ensuring but as an external presence. It's not just a way of kind of keeping Europeans together to balance against external threats like the Soviet Union, but it's also a way of trying to fundamentally shift and impose order on those sort of rampant imperatives which had kind of led to the conditions for the First and Second World War. So, for example, there are strident attempts to sort of finally mollify and create a productive Franco-German working relationship. And to be fair, this is eminently achievable in this particular context because, well, for one thing, Germany is no longer united. You know, it's been divided into East Germany and West Germany, and moreover, it's a fraction of its former territorial size as well. It's lost vast kind of land holdings in the redrawing of the map. And that's actually quite an interesting point because the Treaty of Versailles is often blamed as this sort of thing which led directly into World War II. And part of the Treaty of Versailles was cutting off large parts of Germany and parceling them out to other nations. The exact same thing happens over World War II, just after World War II on a greater scale. So in a sense, you've removed a lot of the threat, which kind of, despite the serious psychological trauma to the French political psyche, which came after kind of 1940, and an enduring fear and mistrust of the potential for German militarism. Nevertheless, that capacity, it becomes clear kind of by the late 1940s that capacity has ultimately diminished. There's not going to be a third world war coming from Central Europe that's, you know, based on German panzers going through the Ardennes. If anything, it's going to be a fear of kind of Soviet tanks coming through the Fulda Gap. So these institutions are created to kind of keep Europe together and to kind of reflect the new conditions which exist. The Coal and Steel Initiative was incredibly important as a trust-building exercise as much as anything else, and it was sort of a French kind of demand if West Germany was going to be allowed to be rearmed and allowed into NATO, which made eminent sense considering, you know, they were on the front line of this new geopolitical conflict. There needed to be trust mechanisms put in place to make sure that Germany kind of couldn't turn on the West again. So coal and steel becomes a massive part of that as well. So these things are all interconnected. But broadly speaking, NATO is a collective defense alliance. Again, you can go through the slides to kind of look at the particular categories that NATO falls into. It's American-led, of course, because the US is not only the most powerful nation state within it and a superpower in its own right, but also its commitment in terms of resources has traditionally been the highest. So that's why you always have a US Supreme Commander and generally a British Deputy Supreme Commander. Although during times in the Cold War, there was a German commander in as well, sort of depending on politics. And NATO's raison d'etre is ultimately this business of Article 5. If it's the provision that if one state is an attack on one member state is to be treated as an attack on all member states. And this is NATO's greatest strength and simultaneously its greatest weakness. It's its greatest strength because it's what gives the alliance teeth. It's why nations perceive utility in it, because they know that in an hour of absolute need, they are going to be able to call upon the resources of their friends and their allies and are able to be part of the longest lasting and qualitatively as well as quantitatively kind of the most powerful alliance which has ever existed. However, that also creates its weakness because it's an incredibly high threshold to meet in terms of credibility. To one another, first and foremost, it's actually harder to kind of reassure allies than it is to kind of deter enemies, because there is always an element of doubt when it comes to political promises, right? So when it comes to reassuring allies, you have to work very, very, very hard to convince allies that you are willing to sacrifice your blood, your treasure, and risk, really, I mean, potentially the very existence of your of your people, of your polity, to defend their sovereignty, to defend their interests and their polity. And this has led to kind of some real Herculean efforts of international diplomacy over the years to maintain this internal credibility. And with that also is the external credibility, convincing your ally, your adversaries, that you will hang together. When push comes to shove. This is actually slightly easier because, as I was saying, that kind of psychology of doubt, there's always a what if. So if allies are always thinking, well, there's always a chance that they may not come, and that's something that needs to be kind of reassured. Adversaries are also, or also have that element of doubt where even if credibility is kind of maybe a bit doubtful, there's always the risk that it will actually come together, and then you're in a harsh position because, by and large, most political actors and institutions tend to be risk averse. You always, the mentality of hoping for the best but assuming and planning for the worst is kind of built into successful political units. It's what allows them to survive, but it also creates these incredibly difficult tasks of credibility. And this has been the case from basically when the ink was still wet on the 1949 Washington Treaty, and it persists to this day. And if anything, things like enlargement, things like Russian reconstitution, things like the increasingly divergent and diverse nature of the alliance are things which endanger this credibility. And if NATO, does if a black swan event of the future is NATO collapsing, I would hazard a guess it would be because of a failure of credibility. Either nations just stop believing in it, or it's tested and is found wanting in some way. So unless anyone has any questions on NATO, I know there's a couple just... Yep, so unless you guys have any questions on NATO, please pop them in the chat if you do. I'm going to move on from that. Finn, will this exam format be identical for all third-year PIR courses? Excellent question. I would assume so. However, I know that some course coordinators, for example, who don't sometimes do exams at all, are going to be in a position now where they're putting something together. So I can't put my hand on my heart and say I know exactly what the layout of every other PIR course is going to be. I would expect they'd be very similar to this, though, because this is really the kind of the usual format for exams at this level. 3 essay questions, and as for the kind of the limitation of 1,000 words per answer, that is school wide. That's being applied to, well, there's no first and second years, but it would have been applied to them, and it's being applied to third and fourth year. Thanks for that, Rebecca. That's good to know. Yeah, and yeah, good. And actually, if you could just say, Rebecca, what those courses are, just and you can kind of use the chat to sort of build up a corpus of which courses are being marked along these lines. I suspect most of them will be, but you never know if there's a random outlier. Pavel, talking about mutual trust among NATO members, how does Turkey do in this regard? Would NATO lose more than it would gain by excluding Turkey? Oh, fascinating question. Yeah, Turkey's a deeply interesting one, actually. And this is why I'm really sad that Young Europeans talk that you were organising and invited me to didn't happen, because this was going to be my main point of discussion. And actually, at this stage, there has been, even though Turkey's kind of a member of NATO, it is, even by the sort of disparate and dissonant standards of kind of NATO today, it is an outlier. Um, in just in regard that it's sort of its political culture and its foreign policy imperatives are so radically different from from other member states, and there has been a history which has been going on for at least the last 15 years, but longer, probably in terms of its development and origins, of Turkey drifting away from the not just the transatlantic alliance, but also from the kind of the European sphere of global influence. And this kind of starts or its modern manifestation starts with the kind of 2008 crash, which really kills off any last sort of embers of Turkish interest in joining the European Union. This had kind of had sort of flatlined years before anyway, as it was becoming increasingly clear that Ankara was not willing to go along with a lot of the really quite serious criterion that the European Union insists on for membership. But as the kind of 21st century has developed, especially with the kind of the tumult and chaos which characterizes the contemporary Middle East, it's been that way more or less throughout history as well. But I mean, we're in a point of particular flux at the moment, and Turkey, from a foreign policy perspective, is drifting, I would say, far more towards becoming a major player in the Middle East than a major player in Europe. And if that comes at the kind of expense of the ire of the Europeans, well, so be it. This government in particular seems absolutely willing to snub its NATO member, its European allies. Bearing in mind as well that there was a point in the last couple of years where two NATO members, the US and Turkey, have practically been conducting a proxy war against one another as the US backed the Kurds to be the kind of boots on the ground when it comes to fighting Islamic State in Syria, and of course the Turkish position has always been to diminish any sort of Kurdish influence in the region by force if necessary. So that kind of tension exists. There's the fact that Turkey is doing arms deals with Russia and has been kicked out of the F-35 program for that. So the long and the short of it is Turkey is drifting away from NATO. And honestly, if Turkey left NATO tomorrow, I doubt that would cause any sort of credibility crisis within the alliance. It might create a few sort of damaging news cycles and a bit of negative speculation, but nothing that would be enduring, because it seems quite clear to any observer that Turkey more or less has one foot out of the door as it is. And the strategic ramifications for that aren't. It'll create some interesting new dynamics, especially when it comes to the geopolitics of the Eastern Mediterranean. But ultimately, the great advantages that the great geopolitical advantages that Turkey brought with it in the Cold War don't really apply now. So, for example, so long as Greece is a member of NATO, the Bosphorus can be closed, and the Russian Black Sea fleet can be bottled up into what effectively becomes a large lake. The accession of Romania and Bulgaria as well gives NATO a footprint in that part of the world. When it comes to the Eastern Mediterranean, a Turkey that has pivoted away from sort of NATO and more into a pro-Russian perspective, given that Assad is going to win the Syrian civil war, that kind of creates an arc of potentially hostile actors in the Eastern Mediterranean. But hey, maritime affairs are not somewhere in which NATO is concerned, and of course, all that really happens there is the British NATO bases in Cyprus become even more valuable. Cyprus would be accepted as a full member state of NATO, since it's only been Turkish objections and vetoes blocking that anyway. So yeah, there'll be some geopolitical shifts, and there'll be some interesting scope for research. But it's not going to be any sort of geopolitical earthquake, I would think, because it's been going that way, for quite some time. And as to what NATO would potentially gain, again, a lot of the problems underlying NATO really aren't, fundamentally rooted in this sort of Euro Turkish nexus. They're to do with the sort of the overall increasing dissonance between member states, and that's just one facet of it. The difference between kind of Western security perceptions and Eastern security anxieties, the kind of economic two-tier system which will result from projects like Nord Stream, where one part of Europe can be threatened with crippling energy sanctions and one part of Europe be fine. These are far more pressing issues. And thanks for that, Rebecca. All right, just FYI, guys. We've hit an hour there, and I've got through kind of 4 of 10, which is fine. I was thinking about, because this is a revision live stream, and the advantage of it over a traditional revision lecture is I could go on a bit longer. So I'm going to go on for another hour. I'm going to get through, brief synopsis of the rest of the course, and take any questions you guys have, any comments you guys have. The chat's been good so far. I don't mind if it's admin stuff or if it's course related. That's absolutely fine. And of course, this is going to be available for you to review anyway. So, moving on from the institutions to the actors. Now, we start with the United States and Russia. And it's sort of testament to the presence of the US as a multi-regional actor, or really the only true global actor, that it's very rare to discuss the kind of regional affairs of any part of the world. Even if it is making more sense to discuss things at a regional level, the US is sort of omnipresent as an extra regional actor. And this is particularly true of Europe, but it would be true of anywhere else as well, to a greater or lesser degree. Very obviously, it's an important point if you're talking about East Asia or if you're talking about the Middle East. But even looking at the Indian Ocean and that kind of area where the US hasn't been, it's been present, but it's not been overt, you still have to consider, what the US is doing when it comes to even for example, the India-Pakistan dynamic. Pakistan's and the US are incredibly reluctant. Partners is too strong a word. They cooperate very in a limited fashion, but on the other side, sort of share much more political culture in common with India. So yeah, just as an aside there, when looking at regional politics, one must always remember to have a look at the US. Now, I have to say that this is a sort of a section of the course that I really enjoyed doing, because when talking about countries, well, for one thing, one has to understand history. Obviously, this is where the importance of time comes in. But this is really a good time to kind of talk about people as well. And that's people both in terms of individuals, whether that's kind of the average citizen or leaders, but also as sort of shared communities with sort of shared kind of cultural links, sort of a community of political values and shared experience over time. Because this is ultimately what produces strategic culture. This is what produces sort of those foreign policy attitudes. And Russia's a fascinating one, in large part because it's been so tragic, and there's so many contradictions involved. For a country that has had several tumultuous experiences in just one century, in just the 20th century. You have World War One, the Revolution, and the fall of the Tsars, the beginning of communism, the Russian Civil War, the World War II, the Soviet Union, and sort of the superpower experience with the rapid decline and degeneration of the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Soviet Union towards the transition towards democracy, towards the transition towards what we have now. That's a busy old century. And yet, with all that chaos and all that change, if you look at kind of the fundamentals of Russian governance, strong, centralized from Western Russia, around about Moscow, um, strict to the point of authoritarian, highly focused on security matters, incredibly large but incredibly vulnerable, and in a you know in a position of working within those constraints of being so large and yet centrally governed. And whether it's a czar, whether it's a party chairman, whether it's a president, and I mean Vladimir Putin in many ways, has power to which any of the kind of the old Russian czars would have wept to have. But ultimately, this is the same broad outline of what Russia has looked like for centuries. Now, again, you guys can go through the slides to kind of to look at the main foreign policy imperatives and stuff like that, and the kind of the same is true of the USA. And when kind of looking at the USA, likewise, its involvement in Europe is optional. There's Russia is a European actor and an actor within European security because it has to be. Its geography and its history and its economics dictate that. Whereas the US, it's more by choice. To be sure, it's definitely in the US national interest to have a strong and friendly Europe, and that was a major part of spending, all that money in the Cold War, not just on things like martial aid, not just on things like developing strong economic links, but also the very expensive business of garrisoning large armies overseas for extended periods of time. That's it's been in the U.S. interest to make those sorts of sacrifices. And as we move into the 21st century, whilst Europe is still an important area for the US and still an important trading partner, and still one that Washington's very sort of invested in the stability of, the tension implicit in that relationship as well of sort of unequal distribution of burden sharing, particularly when Europe is seen to be and is unquestionably in a position to be doing more than it currently is. There's that area of tension, but whilst the US is in the position of having those great boundaries, the Pacific and the Atlantic, this has also cast the United States as a maritime power. A lot of its prosperity comes from the sea, and that means there needs to be someone out there upholding freedom of navigation. And this is very much a torch that was sort of inherited from the British when it became abundantly clear. Well, it's starting to become clear after the First World War. It's transparently clear after the Second that Britain is simply no longer able to be the world's sort of maritime policeman. So this job falls inexorably into the hands of the United States Navy. Um, yeah. But whilst continuing to address that sort of that sense of options and that sense of kind of competing priorities, which are implicit to all uh, powers of no matter what size, but certainly of great powers. There's always going to be good and competing interests for limited resources. Even a superpower's resources are scarce. It's a fundamental condition, and where they are to be applied is a question that is going to be increasingly addressed for the 21st century. We know that, for example, that East Asia is going to keep playing a more and more important role as China emerges as a sort of as a second superpower, and we perhaps shift into a multi-regional world order, which is characterized by two multi-regional kind of great powers. And certainly China is making its influence felt in other places of the world, which may mean that the US will have to divert resources not just to East Asia, but to parts of the world where it hasn't traditionally had very much concern with. So, for example, the Indian Ocean, Africa, um, all of these things are quite possible. But US foreign policy imperatives are ultimately revolve around preserving the status quo, right? The US is the ultimate status quo power, and the job of US foreign policy over the next century is to preserve that, pure and simple. And despite kind of some of the more shaky foreign policy decisions that have come out of various administrations, both Democrat and Republican, since the end of the Cold War, there is at least a kind of an understanding of that and an engagement with that. I'm sure that will continue to be the case. So moving deftly on to the other kind of European powers. Now, for this, we looked at Britain, France, Germany, and as a sort of exemplar of the interests and concerns of newer member states, Poland. And this one kind of follows the same template much as the last lecture, where we kind of look at challenges, we look at advantages, we look at imperatives, we look at the unique and individual sort of strategic culture of each particular actor, because each of them have their own history, that's kind of shared experience. So, for example, both France and Britain kind of experience their own different versions of sort of 1940 syndrome. With France, it's an absolute dedication to not relying on other powers for its own security, and this has contributed to one of those sort of great psychodramas in French politics over the last sort of 50 years, which has been, on one hand, to be along with Germany, the sort of the twin engine driving European integration and ever closer union, whilst on the other hand being absolutely clear that France is responsible for the protection of France and no one else. And no one else is responsible for France, and these two things don't sit easy with each other. Actually, there's been a great deal of kind of conflict between them over the years, and that's exemplified no better than under current arrangements, where you have a very technocratic, intensely Europhile president who's sort of attempting to drag along this very sort of small C, conservative, Gaullist kind of French establishment when it comes to foreign and defence thinking. And whether that clash will be resolved now or whether it will ride out kind of Macron's presidency and continue is going to be an interesting thing to watch. And likewise with the British case, that version of 1940 syndrome is quite different. It's the sort of the need to. It's sort of not that necessarily that that the United Kingdom's first option or first choice would be, ruthless self-reliance, but more if those conditions are forced upon the United Kingdom. Bearing in mind as well that British foreign policy and prior to that English foreign policy has always been about creating as much disunity in the European continent as possible. Because if you don't do that, potentially a hegemon arises, and that hegemon is going to have the resources of a continent to weigh against the resources of an island. It's a deeply unfavourable position. And so, this is the reason why Britain has fought with and against every European power in history, and why it was so fervently unwilling to give in 1940, even though when its sort of outlook was preposterously bleak. and sort of this is the echoes of British foreign policy kind of live on from that moment where we couldn't kind of carry out our imperatives, where a hegemon did arise on the European continent, and we were kind of isolated, which is why, Britain keeps nuclear weapons, for example, but also why Britain, even post Brexit, is going to remain so uh, focused on Europe, and why it will try and position itself at the heart of kind of the NATO alliance and keep NATO relevant, to keep these relationships in place, to prevent um, major changes to the status quo in Europe, because ultimately Britain again is a status quo actor and benefits from how things are. A friendly, stable, secure Europe is in kind of Britain's best interest, but also one of nation states, not a kind of a central overriding power. Which is why, even when it was in the European Union, Britain's overarching single biggest contribution was to try and disrupt things as much as possible. And when it was unable to prevent large um, shifts towards ever closer union, like for example with the single currency, it essentially exchanged its veto for an opt out. Same with Schengen. Now, Germany, of course, and the German question is one of those really fascinating ones, because unfortunately, United Germany's been in the perpetual position of either being too weak or too strong, or perceived to be having been too weak or too strong. And it's an uneasy position to sit in. We're in a position now where I would say tentatively a position of Germany being too weak is possibly coming to an end. As the kind of the clear economic self interest, which has characterized kind of Germany's very impressive handling and harnessing of the European project over, since the end of the Cold War and reunification, has kind of brought it. It's brought it great dividends. It's also brought it great responsibility, and at times it's brought it very, very difficult decisions, like for example having to pay a lot towards not just the running budget of the European Union, but also being at the forefront of guaranteeing a lot of the bailouts that happened to kind of post 2008. And kind of this position of leadership is sort of waking the sleeping giant. It's taking a much more especially under Angela Merkel. I think, however reluctantly, Germany's playing more of a role in kind of the great power politics of Europe. Sorry, I was just checking what that email was there. Yeah, so the question of what is German power for, and what is German power there to do, and what German self-interest and national interest is going to look like, is a real ramifications for Europe. And again, just sort of any questions, just drop them in about kind of nations. But I'm going to move on to the next one now, because that kind of detained us for a little while. I do love talking about this stuff though, and well, the concerns of the sort of the newer member states of Europe, are economic development, which joining the European Union has been useful for. It's going to be interesting though when certain countries, if part of their kind of joining up to the European Union was an eventual commitment to join the eurozone, um, what impacts that will bring to kind of newer Eastern European states who have the example of Southern Europe to look at, um, which was enormously disrupted by having to adopt this essentially Northern European currency, which dramatically upset and increased costs of living, as it would, for example, in Poland. If you replace the zloty with the euro, there would be a tremendous disruption to kind of current living arrangements, which brings with it kind of economic uncertainty and instability and political ramifications. Likewise, a lot of Eastern Europe is is quite heavily dependent on sort of the remittances economy on a kind of on a personal and a family basis. You know, young people go abroad and send money back. This has been something that individuals from every nation around Europe have done for years. It's just a standard part of the economy, but there are more uh, pronounced kind of trends from one to another. And when you are earning a very sort of high value currency like the euro and translating it into a currency with much lower purchasing power, it goes a lot further in the country with lower purchasing power. So the remittances economy in Eastern Europe would be shot by a lot of countries having to kind of join the euro. And that's just when it comes to economics, of course. When it comes to the kind of the more traditional classical security anxieties, of course, the reconstitution of the Russian Federation and its ambitious and yet uncertain and to a degree unscrutable kind of foreign policy post Ukraine is of extreme concern. So moving on to the issues section, and broadly speaking, energy security, hybrid warfare, and disruptives, nuclear weapons. Um, Again, if you've got any specific questions about these, I'll happily address them. But with regards to having to go through each of them in turn, I think we'll be quite quick because ultimately these extraneous issues kind of feed through everything, especially energy security. It's hard to address any one of these topics without considering the question of energy and going by some very good essays which were written on this subject. A lot of you have grasped and grappled with the energy question. Now, for this, of course, we've got Catherine's lecture slides as well, which are incredibly thorough, and pardon me, I'm very grateful to her for that. And when we come to the question of hybrid warfare and disruptive technologies, I essentially picked when it was come to picking exactly which technologies counted as disruptive, as it were. The ones which I consider to be disruptive, which have specific ramifications for Europe, are because we're a very sort of technically advanced part of the world. Tend to be related towards the kind of the digital domain, so cyber security, cyber technology, but of course unmanned systems as well. All of these play a significant role and will play an increasing role within not just the kind of the security of Europe, but also diplomacy. I mean, there is potential here for a whole subfield of diplomacy to spring up around cyber capabilities with its own infrastructure regarding defense, with its own infrastructure regarding norms and deterrence, and how all of these things are managed in a world where the capabilities traditionally reserved to a nation state are genuinely democratized to organizations which perhaps are states, but perhaps which aren't. And also its sort of capacity for regimes which, to use the old appellation, rogue states, which are not only capable of presenting cyber threats, but if you look at examples like North Korea, are actually utterly reliant on a very sophisticated and very intense network of basically cyber criminal activity in order to sustain the current regime. And this is one of those areas where geography isn't entirely divorced from the matter, but it's certainly changed in terms of its relevance. So in the digital domain, physical space, yeah, it doesn't exert the same kind of influence that it does before. The fact that, for example, the US is an ocean away from a bad faith actor in Asia really doesn't matter all that much. However, it's important not to write geography off entirely with this, because it's really crucial to remember that things like the internet have, as I mentioned in tutorials, have this colossal physical infrastructure underpinning them, to the point where running the internet accounted for 10% of the world's entire usage of electricity last year. 3% of global electricity demands just goes on cooling server banks. Think about that for a moment. There is and that's not even counting the energy used domestically to, or productively to kind of power computers. That's just keeping the internet running. And likewise, those sites are, as they exist in the real world, can be as vulnerable as anywhere else to real world threat, and also themselves are subject to potentially cyber threat. So there's this very large physical infrastructure that is scattered around various locations, and that kind of physical, corporeal dimension is one which is, I think, left out of the security debate far too much when it comes to this. Likewise, unmanned systems are a real game changer when it comes to European security, potentially, not just for the capabilities that they possess in and of themselves, but also for the potential revolution in military affairs they present to democracies, which tend to be, by and large, quite casualty averse. And as I mentioned before, from the US experience, it became very, very tempting. And in a sense, you kind of need to, I suppose, always have that kind of empathetic perspective. Because whilst it's entirely legitimate to criticize the Bush and Obama administrations for overusing drones to the point where they were actually quite counterproductive to the to the stated policy objectives of the US in a number of ways, it's sort of it's definitely easy to see why that was tempting to do, because it was sort of very, very low, low silhouette. It was low footprint, and by and large, you were risking either none or very, very, very few US lives in doing so. And I only say very few in the sense that whilst these things are flown and operated remotely, so there's no risk to the pilot, of course, they do need to be launched from bases somewhere remotely close to where you intend to fly kind of an unmanned mission. So there's that kind of small element of risk. But because these things are very sort of long range and high endurance, the risks are well within kind of low to acceptable parameters. So whether or not this will allow wealthy, highly sophisticated, and casualty averse nations to exercise the use of force in a way that they've been increasingly reluctant to do so since the end of the Cold War is a real question, and it's going to affect European security tremendously. And I'll leave some of the more technocratic stuff, like kind of hypersonics, unconventional systems, and missile defense, unless you guys have any specific questions. Just because this stuff's all easy to look up, and the basic principles are on the slides. And likewise with nuclear weapons, obviously these have been a completely central part of security since the Cold War, and Europe remains the most nuclear region in the world. I mean, if you count, France, the UK, Russia, and realistically NATO as a discrete nuclear actor. Because the US kind of supplies weapons, so that's how it manifests itself as a nuclear power in Europe, but also because those weapons are assigned to a distinctly NATO force structure. For example, Italian, German, Belgian, Dutch fast jets are provided provide one half of the force structure. American bombs provide the rest. So the use of nuclear weapons, or the threat of nuclear weapons at the European level, is a distinctly, international creation, and that is unique. There's nowhere else in the world that any sort of arrangement like that. And it's really difficult to think of countries which share such high trust relationships with one another that it would actually be allowed to happen. But with that, nuclear deterrence is still something which very much affects the European continent, and even more so since the rules were basically reversed at the end of the Cold War. Through partially through choice, the kind of the NATO alliance was heavily reliant on nuclear weapons because the Soviets kept such superior conventional forces. Um, and this was partly because conventional forces, are devilishly expensive, and the Western powers didn't want to operationalize their resources in that way. But now the rules have completely reversed. Even though kind of underspending on defense in Europe is endemic, and even though conventional forces have declined just across the board dramatically since the end of the Cold War, especially amongst European powers, NATO combined still is far more powerful, by an order of magnitude at least, than the Russian Federation. Russia is now far more reliant on nuclear weapons than conventional forces, and this is something which kind of plays into all sorts of potentials for conflict and crisis diplomacy, and the potential of kind of seeing nuclear use not to attempt to fight a nuclear war or win a nuclear war, or even use nuclear weapons to achieve military objectives, but rather to achieve political signaling. As a nuclear use as a war termination scenario to somebody on the street sounds absolutely preposterous. And it's only when you start thinking with that unique logic of strategy, you have to go via C to get from A to B, because that's the peculiar logic of strategy. It's only when you think like that makes sense. Uh, and indeed, it's entirely possible to believe that the use of even a single low yield nuclear weapon in Europe would shock one's adversary to the negotiating table, because the risks then just fundamentally change. And likewise, of course, Russia's in a position as well where it has this sort of vast Eurasian hinterland, which is uninhabited, mostly uninhabitable, and yet this is where vast quantities of its resources are, and it's incredibly difficult to defend. So one thing that, and this seems to kind of fly over the head of arms control enthusiasts a lot when they talk about the US and Russia renegotiating another nuclear treaty, what they're fundamentally forgetting is that Russia isn't just concerned with its European security; it's also concerned with the potential of having to protect itself in Asia in the worst case scenario, if this sort of uneasy alliance with, or silent partnership with China should ever significantly and catastrophically deteriorate. How could Russia kind of preserve its security at the most fundamental level in Asia? Well, the advantage of very low population density and very little civilization to kind of restrict one's decision making, and very few of one's own forces to risk, it means that Russia could threaten to disrupt and degrade Chinese conventional forces with its own nuclear weapons. Right. And I think we'll leave that subject there if no one has questions, but if you do, just drop them in the chat. Okay, so finally moving on to the stuff that we covered in our last two lectures, although these are the two that we never actually got to do in person because of this bloody pandemic. Incidentally, I tried to make these as sort of detailed and as narrative focused as I could, not just to give you guys the kind of the arguments, the analysis, and the situation, but also to kind of give you that kind of narrative aspect of telling a tale, which really is what a good lecture should be. It's providing a sort of a way of discussing this through depicting events kind of as they happen, especially when it comes to crises. Crises have a strong narrative component to them because you need to tell a tale in order to communicate them. And I'm not sure how well that kind of came across in the sort of developed lectures, but do you think they worked okay, or were you left quite confused by the kind of the section on crises, whether it's Ukraine or whether it's potential future crises? Like, what are your guys' takes on that? And just while you're typing in some responses to that, I'm gonna answer Simona's question regarding Russia. Has taking back of Crimea been beneficial so far in practice? Oh yes, yeah. So one thing to remember with regard to that is, from an economic point of view, Russia was paying more for the Sevastopol lease in cheap gas subsidies than any country's ever paid for a base ever, as I've remarked on before. So it's not having to do that anymore, which saves it a lot of money. And bearing in mind that the subsidies meant that Russia was providing gas to Ukraine basically at a loss. So whilst it's still providing energy to Ukraine despite what's going on, it's kind of making less of an economic loss there. To say nothing of the fact that its position in the Black Sea is fundamentally assured. And furthermore, within the kind of Russian political psyche, and not without good reason, Crimea has always been seen as part of Russia. And when it fell, when the Soviet Union fell, and because of Gorbachev's sort of goodwill, not Gorbachev, Khrushchev's goodwill kind of tidying up of the internal Soviet border, it was always sort of seen as this terrible mistake of history that Crimea had ended up in a foreign country. So this has done quite a lot for Putin at the domestic political level as well, which isn't to say that's completely synonymous with Russia's interest, but it's certainly within the current government's interest. Okay, so just flicking through these last two lectures, I mean, there's not really much on the face of it I wish to really add to these, because I tried to be really thorough going through them the first time. But again, unless you guys have questions or you or there were things that you were really confused at and perhaps didn't get and need me to elaborate on, I think I'm pretty much done going through the lectures themselves. Is there anything else at all you guys want me to cover? And I'll just I'm going to nip away for 2 minutes. I'm just going to grab a quick cup of tea, and I'll see what's in the chat when I get back. And if you guys got some questions, then I'll address those. And Simonis, you're quite welcome. Okay, back in 2 minutes, guys. Hello, chat. I'm back from the business of being a typical British stereotype and wandering off for a tea break. Let's see. One of the readings on Ukraine, why the... Oh, sure. Um, Thank you for pointing that out, Pavel. I didn't realise that was behind a paywall. I do know one thing that you can do with Foreign Affairs is you can become a subscribe. You don't need to take out a paid membership to be a subscriber. You can subscribe for free and get one article a month. So you could just sign up to it and download and print the article and get it that way. And actually, I would actually quite recommend it because Foreign Affairs is actually a pretty good, high quality publication. And if you subscribe to it and you kind of keep up with it, I think you'll actually um, find a benefit in being able to get one of their, read one of their long form essays from whatever they're going to be doing that month. And sometimes it's terribly useful because the way Foreign Affairs works is They have a theme every month, so there'll be articles on everything the editors have chosen to include, but there'll be a central spine to each issue, and there'll be sort of 6 or 7 long form um, articles and essays done on that. And if it happens to be something that you're interested in, that's really worth getting. But outside of that, and you guys just becoming a free subscriber to get it, I will see if I've got it on this hard drive somewhere and see if I can post it to you. I'm not sure if I will. This might have just been on my university desktop. That is strange though, because I did think it was on Primo. That's interesting. Okay. Sorry, I was just checking that on on Prima there. If I can find it in my own collection, I'll send that out. But yeah, if you take up the free subscription, you'll be able to get it that way, and it'll be useful as well. Being able to get one free article a month. They do produce some good reads. If I can't find that to share to you, Rebecca, pretty happy with all that. Can't think of anything at the moment. Yeah. So procedure for dissertations. That's actually a really good question because a good old dissertation chat is one of those things I'd wanted to do with you guys in the closing week and kind of just got sort of scuppered by this whole business. Um, Generally, under normal conditions, the procedure for dissertations are that there's formal teaching set aside for it, so it'll constitute one of your modules next semester, and it'll be due in the middle of January. But we really advise that you start as early as possible. Usually, under normal circumstances, I would be saying that actually April, so now, is a good time to be thinking about what general direction you want to go in, what subject you think you're interested in, and start exploring kind of particular avenues you could take, gaps in the literature, things that you want to talk about, things that you want to research as well, and start kind of contacting staff who might be good fits uh, to be supervisors. However, with the way things are, I definitely wouldn't recommend reaching out to staff at the moment, just on the basis of they're getting so many emails a day, it'll be easy for it to get lost. In any case, you are assigned supervisors in September regardless, and we do our best to match the supervisor with the supervisee in terms of research interests. But in terms of what you should be doing now, spend this summer and actually maybe take lockdown as an opportunity to kind of start giving this some thought. I know you've still got exams that you're preparing for and that kind of thing, but it's one of those things that, every good or the best dissertations I've marked have always been from students who started well in advance because they took the opportunity of the summer to basically get stuck into some reading and get stuck into some research. And I know it seems kind of a big, scary topic, and to be sure, it is qualitatively different from anything you've ever done before. But that's not to say it's undoable. It's eminently doable. It's just a question of picking something that you can write a lot about, that's got a lot of good evidence there, that's got a lot of good literature, and which most of all is going to sustain your interest, because there are times where you're going to be absolutely sick to death of this thing. And there are times where you're going to really enjoy it. And for most of the rest of the time, it's just going to be bloody hard work. So it's always best to pick something you're interested in and start as early as you can. Those are the two best bits of advice I can give you. As for the basic procedure, well, like I say, if you've identified an aim and you've identified the next thing will be to find your kind of gap in the literature, find what about that subject you want to answer. So, to take an example off the top of my head, if you're interested in the subject of and now my mind goes completely blank when I go to think of an example. I don't know. The Syrian civil war and the kind of geopolitics of the Syrian civil war. Well, you've got a massive topic there, and so what you need to do is you need to find kind of what is what is your niche there, and how can you break down this kind of big topic. So what you might want to do is look at the strains that this has put on US-Turkish relationships as a result of the civil war in Syria. And you might come at it from the perspective of, you want to answer the question, what has been the effect, if any, on US-Turkish relationships as a result of, probably you're talking the latter phases now of the Syrian civil war. And you'll refine that a bit further. You'll say, well, realistically, the time period concerned dates from not the early phases of the Syrian war, but really everything's happened since kind of the popular rise of ISIS into the kind of the Islamic State, the territory possessing caliphate. Okay, so you kind of look at that, and then you examine literature. And once you've got your question refined, and you might ask about a supervisor, if you don't kind of get a supervisor, you'll have one assigned to you. But you will then go out and sort of conduct a proper piece of research. So you'll be thinking about methodology, and I can really, really emphasize this. Methodology might be dull, but it's earnest. It's important. It is the building blocks of scholarship. And it's where I've seen a lot of dissertations fail, is because students have either ignored or just completely misunderstood what the value of methodology is. It's basically how you go about conducting a study, right? It's how you make what you say meaningful, essentially. Because what logical, consistent, and solid foundations is it intellectually built upon. So you'll kind of, and you'll probably be using some theory as well. Now, it could be quite a heavy theory, it could be quite light touch, but broadly speaking, you'll have an introduction where you set your frames of reference, you talk a bit about your question, you'll then transition into a literature review where you will look at basically the state of knowledge on this subject. Okay, you will be kind of presenting a lot of the big ideas. You'll be presenting a lot of debates. You'll be offering a critique of the current literature and thinking, what's good, what's bad, what leaves something to be desired. And this is where you kind of identify your niche. This is where you say that, okay, I've identified that this is under researched and needs to be researched because there is some stuff in the literature which just does not adequately reflect this. And you'll probably spend about 500 words on the introduction. This is a standard dissertation template, right? But all of them take this standard template and deviate them a bit because it depends, on the demands of your own study. But 500 words roughly for an introduction, usually about 1,500 words for a literature review. Theory and methodology, which, as I say, is the kind of the scholarly foundation, the building blocks of the thing itself, about 1,000-ish words on that. And you'll have 1,000 words for your conclusion, because your conclusion isn't just sort of bullet point summary. Your conclusion is taking this sort of wealth of analysis and this wealth of reading that you've done and synthesizing findings from it. You are producing findings. What has your study found out? And it's probably not going to be kind of snappy little sort of like natural science. We've proved that this element exists, or we proved that this cannot exist, or this is inconclusive. Because this is social science, you'll be talking in terms of the big kind of trends, the big overarching themes, the kind of the macro issues involved. So, you might kind of have that. To use the Syrian, US, Turkish example, you might be looking at kind of their big, the big themes like will it, future of Turkey's participation in nature, future trajectory of Turkish foreign policy, future projection of kind of US policy towards Europe, towards Turkey, and how this could affect Middle Eastern politics. But the findings you'll be presenting there are going to be brought up from the main bulk of the work, right? And that's the chapters. What 2 is usual, 3 potentially. It'll depend on the contours of your own study. But your body chapters are about 5,000 words, 5 to 6,000 words, where you are just producing in-depth discussion, where you're producing analysis. There's going to be a bit, of course, where you're going to have to, talk about the subject, and large descriptive passages are normal for especially the early stages of kind of dissertation chapters. But this is kind of the meat and drink of the thing. So to use the US Turkish thing there, this is where you'd analyze the kind of why have they been brought into conflict? So you'd maybe have a chapter on Kurdish relations. You'd maybe have a chapter on kind of what Turkey's disposition is in terms of certain actors in the region. Can it live with the al-Assad regime? What's its relationship to the Ayatollahs? What's it kind of looking to get out of this chaos? Where can it push its influence? And likewise, what are the US overriding objectives? What's its kind of ideal end game as well? What are its allies? What are its interests? And you would just examine all this. You would present sort of the detailed analysis of the evidence, and from that you draw those kind of 1,000 words of findings, and that's basically how you write a 10,000 word dissertation, more or less. And trust me, when you start planning, those 10,000 words go way quicker than you could ever have imagined. But if any of you have any other questions, again, on dissertations, feel free to drop me an email. My contract with the university will be ending at the end of May, but nevertheless, so this university email address is going to be defunct after that. But up until then, by all means, drop me any kind of questions you may have, and if you want to stay in touch after that, by all means, kind of find me on LinkedIn. It's always a pleasure to stay in touch with good students, and you guys have been really top notch. Pavel, just to clarify the process of picking a supervisor for my dissertation. In any case, the supervisor will be allocated. Yeah, so sorry to clarify that. You can approach a supervisor, and they will. And if you both agree that yes, if the supervisor agrees to supervise it, that will be factored in. So that supervisor will then tell the kind of the overall course coordinator for dissertations, look, this student has approached me. This is going to be one of my allocated dissertations this year. However, if that hasn't been set up in advance, then what the dissertation course coordinator will do will look at the list of proposals and basically compare that to the kind of the research competencies of faculties and make the best connections they can. Now, we're limited in terms of the number of dissertations we're allowed to supervise, which is why if you've got a subject that falls squarely within a certain member of staff's kind of expertise and you really want to work with them, it makes sense to approach them before September. It doesn't have to be now, and it's probably best to let the semester end at this stage. But say, for example, you want to write a dissertation that relates to sub-Saharan African security. Well, Manu is going to be the best chap for the job there because that's his area of expertise. If you want to do anything with kind of quantitative methods, Kat is going to be a great choice because she's the quant person, and so on and so forth. But if you haven't got that relationship in place beforehand, don't worry because you will be assigned one. And you'll be assigned kind of the best possible one. Obviously, we don't have kind of endless staff for kind of to cater for every interest, but certainly, you will be assigned one. And everybody's kind of good at it because we've got a very experienced cohort of staff as well, which is good. Rebecca, this also might be a silly question, but does dissertation topic have to be related to what we want to do after uni? No, it's not a silly question at all. In a sense, no, not really. It doesn't have to be. But what most students will do, if they've got their eye on, at this stage, a particular postgrad degree, they'll sort of tailor their dissertation towards it to kind of show competency in that area. And it can be kind of useful for admissions. But frankly, the person that's controlling your admissions for postgrad isn't going to read your undergrad dissertation. So it's nice to be able to put it in your application letter that, hey, I wrote a dissertation on this, I'll be really good at this master's, but it's not it's not massively necessary that you have to, it's just kind of a nice bonus. And it's a nice, it can be on a not just sort of applying to places level as well, it can be deeply useful for you personally. If there's something that you specifically want to do after this to get yourself, use the opportunity to get yourself familiarized with it. So, for example, if you wanted to, go into your respective country's diplomatic service when this is done, well, anything that kind of takes you into the understandings of international diplomacy, of treaties, of that sort of thing is going to be useful. It's an excuse to read up, and if possible, you might be able to visit an archive or visit an institution as well. And so, if you're in an interview later and you say, "Yes, okay, I came in to actually have a discussion or set up an interview with someone from here," it shows that extra bit of willing. So it can be useful in that regard, but it's by no means mandatory. I mean, to give you my personal example, I wrote my undergraduate dissertation on the application of Machiavelli's ideas to understanding the Egyptian revolution. And then I did a PhD on nuclear weapons and geopolitics. So nothing's set in stone. Right, guys, that's just over 2 hours. So thank you for staying logged in as long as you have, and it's been a real pleasure. Uh, and I don't think there doesn't seem to be any more questions popping up in the chat, so I'm going to say thank you very much and stay safe. and look after yourselves. And it's been an absolute pleasure meeting you. And my it's to my regret that I didn't get to take you guys out for a course drink when we were finished, which is what I like to do at the end of this course, and would have very much enjoyed this time around because again, you guys have been truly great. You're a remarkable bunch, and I'm sure you're all going to do very well in the future. And yeah, like I say, if you have any questions, drop me emails, and if you want to stay in touch, by all means, that's great. And best of luck. And I look forward to reading your exams. And all the best to your future as well. Thank you very much, Pavel. Thanks. Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks, Simonis. And Rebecca, if you end up on BuzzFeed again, do let me know because that was funny. Okay, I've got to let the stream run just like a little minute or so, just so you guys can catch up. Because if I hit end, it crashes really abruptly. So thank you and stay safe.